Melanie Maksin is the Librarian for Political Science, International Affairs, Public Policy, and Government Information at Yale University. She received her MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh, go Pittsburgh, and is currently an MA student in Higher and Postsecondary Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research interests include critical pedagogy and academic librarianship and instruction and outreach approaches related to government information and other primary sources. And she has had one of the most popular, couple of the most popular webinars that we've put up on our new YouTube channel.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. So this afternoon's webinar is, the title is taken from a quote from Lord Palmerston. "We have no eternal allies, we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." So the context is a little different than the context we'll be talking about today, but I think it's a nice way to kind of frame foreign relations and foreign affairs research with government information. That there's kind of a lot to keep track of. Who are our allies, who are our enemies at any given time, and what are we trying to do? What is the government trying to do around the world? So in this session, I'm going to talk a bit, sort of briefly at first, about some of the issues with foreign affairs research with government information and some of the strategies that I've used when working with students and other researchers. And then finally, we'll spend a bit of time looking at some sources. And this is not a comprehensive look at every possible foreign affairs source in the government information world. There is so much to choose from, but I hope that some of these resources will maybe be new to you, or they'll be familiar, but you'll get a chance to spend some more time with them. So some of the issues when we think about foreign affairs research with government information is that there's just so much to choose from. There are so many different types of sources, everything from telegrams, memoranda, correspondence, diplomatic materials, to published or unpublished reports, materials that were intended for a more public-facing audience as opposed to kind of internal records of a department, things like treaties. There's just so much, and of course it's not in one place, as we all know, but there's just a lot of different types of information out there. So that's one thing that you'll want to keep in mind when you're looking for sources, thinking about all of the variety that you have to choose from. To go along with that, there are also lots of topics within foreign relations. So everything from intelligence and diplomacy to aid and sanctions, looking at national security issues. Again, as many sources and topics as there are, we have a rich body of resources to draw on. There are also different levels of access to foreign affairs information. So of course there are published documents. There are also things that weren't published or maybe intended for internal use only that you might be able to find in sources or places like the National Archives. And then there are also all of the classified documents that may or may not have been declassified. Some of them might appear in subscription databases. Some are on microfilm, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Some things you might need to request through FOIA or an MDR request. There are lots of different places to go for these documents. The other issues are kind of related to just the nature of bureaucracy and the complex interactions between different branches and agencies, because foreign affairs isn't the domain of just one department or just one branch. So, so there's not one place to go because there are so many agencies and departments that are involved. And of course, those agencies and departments have changed over time, and some of their functions have changed, some of them have been offloaded to other agencies or departments, and as agendas change, so too do the types of information that are available. So some of the strategies that I use, the first things that I think about if I'm meeting with a student who says, I'm interested in a foreign affairs related topic, I'm interested in the United States and maybe United States relationship with Burma, or with basically anywhere around the world. So what do I start to think about? The first question is, start to think about what's actually available. And this is in terms of what's available for the time period. You'll find that there are more resources for the 20th century, specifically the kind of first half of the 20th century, and things are sort of sparse on either end of that golden middle period. So thinking about what's actually available can kind of shape where we go to find the sources. There's also differing levels of availability depending on the country or region that researchers are interested in. There are some topics and regions that are very well covered and others not so much. There are some things that have been, some documents that might be available in published formats for things like topics related to the Cold War. Anything Cold War related, there's sort of a booming scholarly industry. So those sources will be a bit easier to find than some of the sources for, you know, like late 19th century kind of relations with some smaller countries. And finally, thinking about availability, it helps to think about if there's a particular topic or incident that around which you can kind of structure your search. So if there was a war, if there were some sort of concrete thing that you can point to, that can sometimes help in the search for sources, because otherwise you're just sort of looking and hoping to hit on something that, that fits the time period, fits the country. So thinking about what's actually out there in terms of what's accessible, I mentioned that there are some published documents or archival records, and things that are either declassified now, that could be available in databases of declassified documents or elsewhere, and then some things that you might actually want to go through the process of requesting, either through a Freedom of Information Act request or a mandatory declassification review request. And I won't talk too much about the what to do if the document you want is classified, or if you suspect there could be some classified documents out there. I will give some resources at the end to help think about that, but that's an entirely, well, for the purposes of this afternoon, it's an entirely different ball of wax. And then finally, there are some resources, either subscription databases, there are some freely available databases and collections, there are resources on microfilm, there are some published print volumes of sources, and knowing what's available and accessible through those formats can be very helpful, because in some cases it saves researchers a trip to, say, the National Archives or a presidential library. The other strategies I use are kind of, they're strategies that I think a lot of us use when we're working with researchers, and we recommend this to students in particular. So kind of figuring out what other scholars have done to either locate these sources or to conceptualize the types of sources that might be available. So some of my go-to resources, there's a 2-volume, and I believe it's also available online. It's in its 2nd edition, and they're working on a 3rd edition now, the American Foreign Relations 1600 set, which has just a wealth of resources, both primary and secondary sources related to U.S. foreign relations. So it's produced by the Society of for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and on their own website they call it magisterial, which I just find so delightful. It really is a magisterial publication, and it's very helpful for figuring out what types of sources are available for your time period, for your region, for your topic. The other source that I've been looking at a bit lately is The Craft of International History by Mark Trachtenberg, and most of it is kind of recommendations for doing the work of international history. So he goes through and kind of looks at various foreign relations documents and kind of how to put together an argument and what to do when the sources differ. But the material at the back, there are some great appendices related to actually finding primary sources, and I recommend it highly if you're wondering either what's available in the US context, or if you're working with a researcher who says, okay, so now that I have the US government documents related to foreign relations with this country, what can I do to find that country's foreign relations materials? And Trachtenberg does a great job of highlighting some of the major resources for things like British foreign relations documents and kind of other foreign relations sources that can be a really great complement to the US sources. The other strategy that I often propose is looking at the secondary sources, because sometimes it can be difficult to know what's out there, and the secondary sources are a great way to get started with that. So one question that I had, actually it was a few questions from a few students. In the spring, there was a new class being taught actually in the music department at Yale on jazz diplomacy during the Cold War. So all of these students were interested in government documents about the cultural diplomacy programs that happened during the Cold War, during which various jazz musicians were sent to the Soviet Union and elsewhere to kind of to promote friendship and promote kind of U.S. interests around the world. So the students had a lot of secondary material but weren't sure where to go for the primary sources, and that was when I said, okay, let's kind of sit down with your secondary sources and get a sense of where the sources are coming from, because I looked in kind of some of my go-to sources, didn't really see anything, and it turns out that a lot of those materials are actually at the National Archives. So for a one-semester research paper, for undergrad researchers, maybe going to the National Archives wasn't something that they could do, but at least knowing the types of sources that scholars used and kind of thinking about other strategies that they might employ to find their own sources, I think that was a really helpful way to use the secondary literature, because my go-to sources, as I said, weren't turning up anything about, you know, what Dizzy Gillespie was doing during that time period. As I said, one of the issues is that the foreign policy, foreign affairs situation is so complex that there isn't just one department or agency or even one branch that's responsible for foreign policy. And I just grabbed a few seals here, but there are plenty of other agencies and entities that have some stake in either the creation of foreign policy or the promulgation or the development or kind of overseeing various programs. So these are just a few of the examples of who's involved, and we won't get to see too many sources from all of these entities, but I hope that, that we'll get to cover a few of them. So the first resource for foreign affairs information that I would go to is the State Department. So the Department of State, just to give a little history lesson, was created in 1789. It oversees international relations, implements foreign policy, and operates diplomatic missions around the world. And of course, the head of the State Department is the Secretary of State, who advises the President on foreign policy. So in addition to those types of projects and responsibilities, there are also elements of public diplomacy, foreign aid, and development assistance that come up in the Department of State's portfolio. So some of the resources that you'll see, including things like the decision to send jazz musicians abroad during the Cold War, that's coming from the Department of State, but not necessarily in its in the way that we think of it as its role implementing foreign policy and overseeing international relations. So current information is on the State Department's website, state.gov, and I wanted to highlight some of the resources that you can find there and some resources that you can find elsewhere too, some of the major publications. So the first thing, the State Department does put together information about countries, and including information for travelers. So a lot of us have probably seen this kind of travel advisories, things to know before you leave the country and make sure that you're as safe as one can possibly be. The resource that used to be called the State Department Background Notes, that some of you might be familiar with, is now called the Bilateral Relations Fact Sheets. So these are, they're basically fact sheets about U.S. relations around the world. So you can kind of go and get an overview of the situation of foreign affairs between the United States and your country of interest. The diplomatic list is kind of highlights of the diplomatic stations around the world, who the diplomats are, and just kind of the basic information that you might want to know about what's happening with the diplomatic staff around the world. Some of the reports that the State Department produces are very interesting, and a lot of these are available on the website. Two that I wanted to highlight in particular are the country reports on human rights practices and the country reports on terrorism. So kind of in keeping with the idea of the State Department providing information about the state of affairs in particular countries. These country reports are really fascinating. The human rights practices documents are kind of looking at kind of how well a country lives up to its kind of human rights obligations as conceived by the United Nations. One of the things that when I'm talking to students about the country reports on human rights practices, one of the examples I like to give is the annual report on human rights practices in China, which every year, basically, since the State Department has issued these reports, China has issued its own report, which is the kind of report on human rights practices in the United States. So China is not rebutting what the State Department says about China's human rights practices, but rather turning the lens on the United States. And as you might imagine, the report for last year was very interesting, kind of looking at race relations in the United States as kind of a dimension of human rights policy failures. So there's some interesting things like that, beyond just what's available from the State Department, kind of how those information sources might interact with the information sources from other countries and governments. So the country reports on terrorism, another great source that's sort of, for all of these things, kind of considering where this information is coming from. But these series of reports are very interesting, and you can kind of go back and kind of get a sense over time of how situations have developed in different countries. The State Department magazine, called State Magazine, is kind of a, how would I classify it? It's sort of a magazine for employees at home and abroad, so kind of a magazine for the diplomatic community. There are some earlier publications that had some of that kind of content. So the State Department Bulletin, published from 1939 to 1989, and the Dispatch from 1990 to 1999 have sort of some of that content about what's going on in the State Department, what's happening at the diplomatic posts around the world, but then also had kind of statements of U.S. policy related to public and private international law. So that could be an interesting resource. It's not something that I think of immediately, but I always have to nudge myself to remember that it's there, because sometimes when looking for 20th century State Department information, it can be helpful to get kind of an overview of the situation from the State Department Bulletin. But I think that the real jewel in the crown of the State Department is the Foreign Relations of the United States series, or FRUS. So it's produced by the State Department's Office of the Historian, and it has been published since, well, it covers the time period since 1861, and the volumes are still being produced, but I believe that we're starting to get into the 1980s now, like the very early 1980s, with the volumes that are coming out, and I'll talk a bit more later about why that's the case. But these volumes consist of documents from the State Department as well as the Department of Defense. National Security Council memos are often included in FRUS. There are documents from the CIA and basically other agencies that are involved in foreign affairs. You will find documents from those agencies in Foreign Relations of the United States. It also includes documents from presidential libraries, the National Archives, and even some personal papers from the collections of diplomats and others involved in foreign policy. So one of my colleagues, I loved the way that he described this. He called it the official WikiLeaks. So basically a way to get at the diplomatic activity of the past, but this is actually produced by the State Department, produced and compiled by the State Department. There are a few ways to access FRUS. So the one way that we're going to be looking at in this presentation is through the website of the Office of the Historian. There are some other access points. The University of Wisconsin Digital Collections includes FRUS. It doesn't have all of the most recent volumes, though, so something to keep in mind is that some of these access points are a bit more complete than others. Hein Online, which is a subscription database that, if you're familiar familiar with legal resources, you will probably have encountered Hein Online, and so it's one of their many collections related to government information. And that does have the full run back to 1861 to the present. And finally, the other access point that I want to mention is print. I really do actually use the print volumes. I don't tell students that they need to necessarily sit down with every print volume and go through that way, but I like to bring the print volumes to classes. I like to show them to students when we initially sit down and talk about doing foreign affairs research, because I think it really helps them get a sense of why they might use these volumes, what they'll find, where the sources are coming from, how it's organized. It's the kind of thing that a keyword search in the database just doesn't really capture very well, so I think that showing the print is helpful, and I definitely schlep a bunch of volumes all over campus whenever I'm doing instruction sessions, and probably injured my back doing that, but it's worth it for FRUS. It's a great series, and I really do think that the print volumes are helpful. But to turn away from the print and go to the Office of the Historian of the State Department's website, so the main page for FRUS kind of gives a sense of how it's organized. The basic idea, at least for the 20th century volumes, is that they're organized by administration, and then within the administration years, they're usually broken out by country or region. So there are also some volumes we'll talk about in just a second that are arranged by topic and not necessarily just by region, but usually the kind of administration and then country or region is the way that they're set up, and then specific years. So from this site, you can do keyword searches. You can also browse by volume. So if you know that you're interested in a particular range of years, particular country, you can go directly to that volume and get a lot of helpful information and search that way, but you can also do keyword searches. Some of the topical volumes that aren't specific necessarily to one country include a series of volumes on the intelligence establishment. So the first one picks up with the emergence of the intelligence establishment, 1946 to 1950. There are some volumes on specific events or crises or issues, so the Cuban Missile Crisis and aftermath, 1961 to 63. There are volumes for a variety of years on foreign economic policy, kind of looking at the economic dimension of foreign policy. Documents on arms control and non-proliferation, the energy crisis, human rights and humanitarian affairs. There are other volumes on things like relations with the United Nations, just a lot of different types of topics. So if you're not necessarily seeing the years that you want for a particular country, try looking a little more broadly and see what else was produced from that administration, because you might find some of these more general topical volumes that are very useful. So this is an example of just kind of one of the volumes. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis and aftermath. This is the kind of front matter. So this is from the State Department's website. It's very similar to the print version. Of course, this one has links. But inside the kind of front cover, you'll get a lot of good information about what's happening, a sort of overview essay of what's going on during that time period in that place. The link for sources is incredibly helpful because it talks about where the materials in the volume are coming from, as well as other related collections and sources that might be of use. So like for this volume on the Cuban Missile Crisis, we learn from following the sources link that there are materials from the Kennedy Library. There are things from the Department of State files from the National Archives, the Department of Defense records at the Washington National Records Center. And then toward the end, we even get into things like which files from the National Archives are included. So if you wanted to go and get more information, you can trace the list of sources in FRUS. There are files from the CIA, the Department of Defense, the National Defense University, and this will show you kind of where some other document collections and publications might be held. So this one includes things like the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency's documents on disarmament, the CIA's documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a fantastic way to find primary sources through FRUS, but also to see what other collections are out there, and including what other published collections of documents might be available for your research. So here are some examples of some of the documents from this volume, and you can see that they're coming from lots of different places. So there is everything from memorandum of telephone conversation to records of the National Security Council, telegrams. There's this very helpful little editorial note you'll find throughout the FRUS volumes that they're very good about including notes and kind of contextual information about what's happening and what we're seeing in the documents. So it's a really great tool for advanced scholars and more novice researchers alike, because there's just so much helpful information in these volumes. I wanted to really quickly go into one of the documents. So this is a telegram from the Department of State to the Embassy in Brazil. And there's a little button that says source that you can hover over to get information about where the document comes from. And again, this is a way to see if where the document's coming from, but also if there are other materials held, say, at the National Archives that could be of use. This can point you in the right direction. So it includes things over on the right sidebar. You can see the persons involved, and you can find more in the FRUS collection related to those individuals. There's also some helpful guidance about the abbreviations used. One abbreviation that I wanted to see here and didn't was NIACT, which is night action. Basically, this is an item for immediate action, and the embassy in Brazil was supposed to get on this immediately after receiving this telegram. So you do see things like how the document was classified, and kind of who created it, who cleared it, and who's allowed to see it. So some other helpful bits of information from the State Department's version of the FRUS collection online. Under related resources on the right sidebar, the history of the series is fascinating, and also the link to more about the Foreign Relations series. It's kind of understanding the evolution of the series over time, how the volumes are compiled. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there. One link that I often share with students and other researchers is the status of the series link. And this will show you what's been published recently, what's planned for publication, and where things are in the pipeline. So if there are volumes under declassification review, this is where you would go to figure out what's coming. And as you can see from this, there are plenty of volumes from the 60s and 70s that are still in the works. There's even a volume in production, the Iran volume 1951 to 1954 it has not been released. It is still planned for publication in 2016 at the earliest. So being aware of what's coming and when you might expect it can be very helpful for researchers who are wondering, why can't I get to these documents from the 1980s? And you can find out that you'll get to see them probably in 2017, 2018 or so. So I love FRUS. I mean, I love it enough to carry it around campus with me. I show people the volumes in print, and I'm not a print fanatic in any sense, but there are some real limitations. The first one is that it only begins in 1861. So for anything before 1861, you're going to need to go to other sources for foreign affairs information. So one source in particular, and kind of sort of the major source to know about, is American State Papers, which is accessible through the Library of Congress's American Memory site, which covers 1789 to 1817. Of course, there's still the 1817 to 1860 gap that you're looking at, but a source like the title of which is escaping me now, the source that I mentioned in the beginning about American foreign relations since 1600 can help fill in some of those gaps for specific topics and foreign affairs with specific countries. So not only does it begin kind of late, there's a significant time lag in producing the volumes. And this is largely related to the process of getting materials declassified, which is an issue for historians, not just with FRUS, but in other contexts as well. But if you're interested in reading about this, kind of looking in America History and Life and other historical databases and publications for FRUS, you'll find a lot of historians kind of griping about the process and the need to be able to access materials related to diplomacy and foreign affairs in a reasonably timely way and to have access as open as possible. So those are some of the limitations of FRUS, but depending on the time period, the country, it's a really, really rich resource. So I've mentioned microfilm a couple times in passing, and yes, I was being serious. There are a lot of microfilm collections that include State Department materials and some other materials as well, and I love to share these with students because in some cases, it's saving them a trip to the National Archives to do the research in the reading rooms there. And I think it's just, there's so much that's available, but this can really help researchers go in depth for their time period, their country, and the type of information they're looking for. So some of the microfilm collections that I like to point researchers to are from the National Archives. So one of the sets is the Consular Despatches. So they're reports to the Department of State from U.S. diplomatic representatives stationed abroad. So it's mostly late 19th through early 20th centuries. I believe that at least part of this collection has been kind of repackaged for online use by ProQuest and History Vault. So they do have I believe it's diplomatic dispatches of the past. So some of that content might actually be in one of the History Vault collections if you are a History Vault user and would like to consider that collection. The other major source of State Department information on microfilm are the State Department central files. So these are the central files held at the National Archives in College Park, and depending on the publisher who produced them, they'll have slightly different names. So you'll see either confidential U.S. State Department central files or records of the State Department relating to a particular country. These series are fantastic. They have kind of some similarities to the FRUS volumes and the types of materials that you'll find there, things related to diplomacy, foreign affairs, as well as internal affairs for countries. So with the confidential U.S. State Department Central Files series, you'll often see that for the same time period, there will be two sets. One set is for the foreign affairs of a country, and one is for its internal affairs. So this can be a nice way to learn more about what was actually happening internally in a country, at least as seen by the U.S. State Department. So I often, even when students are kind of not necessarily looking for U.S. relations with another country, but they're looking for sources in English about a country that they're interested in, I sometimes point them to these files depending on, if they're interested in this time period, because the internal affairs documents can be quite interesting. So this is very strong holdings for the early to mid 20th century. So that's kind of the sweet spot for the microfilm collections from the central files. And some of the files are actually included in the Archives Unbound collections from Yale. So if you are familiar with the Archives Unbound collections, you can check out the list of, I think it's the International Relations, International Affairs collections. And a lot of the source material that they're drawing from are actually these State Department files that are also available on microfilm. So if your library doesn't have these microfilm collections, you can likely make interlibrary loan requests for them. The microfilm that was produced by the National Archives, you can actually borrow from the National Archives or purchase from the National Archives. So there are some ways to get this if you don't currently have access. In addition to the State Department materials on microfilm, there are lots of other series related to foreign affairs, intelligence-related topics. So the records of the Office of Strategic Services, one of the predecessors to the CIA, those are available on microfilm, or at least selections are available on microfilm. CIA research reports on various countries are available on microfilm. The records of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, national security files organized by administration. And again, a lot of these are really kind of early to mid-20th century, specifically mid-20th century, very good for that time period. And the publishers who were producing these, and in some cases still are producing these, the National Archives publishes some of their, or kind of packages some of their own microfilm, University Publications of America, and Primary Source Media, which is ProQuest and Yale, respectively. So in addition to the State Department materials that I've already mentioned, I want to just kind of throw in a plug for looking at congressional materials when thinking about foreign affairs research. So as Margaret Herman writes in The Study of American Foreign Policy, the President is the Commander-in-Chief, the Chief Negotiator, and the Chief Diplomat, but the Congress makes laws, must ratify treaties, and appropriate funds. So actually keeping sight of the role of Congress in foreign affairs can be helpful because it opens up so many different types of resources for research. So the two congressional committees that you'll probably encounter for foreign affairs research, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. So I've included links to both of their websites. And their responsibilities are fairly similar, so they kind of, they talk about their responsibilities slightly differently. So the Senate Committee talks about developing and influencing U.S. foreign policy. That's sort of their language about it. And the House Committee on Foreign Affairs considers legislation that impacts the diplomatic community. Sort of similar responsibilities, kind of worded a little differently. One thing that's a bit different about the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations is that it holds confirmation hearings for high-level State Department positions. So that's one potential information source to keep in mind, that if you find the text of, that if there are confirmation hearings, you will potentially get into a lot of good information about foreign relations from that perspective. So with the congressional sources, there's a variety. You can find press releases on the committee's websites. There are, of course, hearings. I believe both committees have some video available from their hearings. So even if the print hearing hasn't been published yet, you can, in many cases, watch video or get some of the testimony from the website. And of course, bills, treaties, the congressional record, and even CRS reports. So the strategies that you would use to find these sources, kind of keep that in mind as you're doing foreign affairs research, because there's a lot of good stuff there, and especially something like a CRS report that can lay out kind of an overview of what's been happening, kind of where policy is going, and it can be a fantastic way to give your research a boost. So I've mentioned already a couple subscription databases that might be worth exploring. So I mentioned Archives Unbound from Yale, which includes some of the State Department central files collections. The Digital National Security Archive from ProQuest, which is, I believe they have 40-some distinct collections at this point, looking at, it's mostly 20th century, but includes some more kind of recent issues, including things like electronic surveillance. Those are some of the more recent topics. So it's kind of, let's say, post-World War II to present in those collections. And that will include materials from the State Department, CIA documents, things that they have submitted FOIA requests for, things that have been declassified, and they're organized by topic, so you could potentially kind of purchase them bit by bit if there are certain areas that are of particular interest on your campus. History Vault, also from ProQuest, is another resource for this kind of information. And I mentioned that some of the microfilm sets are starting to appear in History Vault. So the Office of strategic studies, not strategic studies, strategic services. Wow, long day already. And some of the State Department central files are actually now going to be in History Vault too. So, so some of these microfilm collections are beginning to kind of trickle into subscription databases, which I guess can be good or bad depending on how you feel about paying for them. One other resource I wanted to mention is from Brill. It's Cold War Intelligence Online, and it is primarily U.S. declassified documents related to Cold War intelligence. So this is just a small sampling of what's available, but some of these collections can be very helpful, and they're things that would be very hard for particularly students to get to otherwise. So, you know, so if you have any questions about these, I would be happy to give some more information about those databases. I also wanted to share links to some of my research guides. So I put together a guide for foreign relations research, which is what I often teach from in the classes where I talk about FRUS and State Department resources. I often direct students to the Foreign Relations Guide. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't going to go too much into other resources for declassified documents, but I have pulled together some resources in the Declassified Documents Guide. And then finally, I have some information on my guide to research in the National Archives. I work with a lot of researchers who do end up making trips, but I like to emphasize that it's possible to get some of those collections on microfilm, specifically the State Department materials. So I have some information about the kind of strategies for figuring out what's at the National Archives, what's on microfilm, and how to think about your research at the National Archives that might be of use to some of you as well. All right, so with that, I say thank you, and I ask for any questions or comments. Or if there's anything that you were really hoping that I would talk about that I didn't, you can throw that out there and share with the group. Do I know if the State Department has a library that will work with the public on research questions? So I was just, when I was looking at the State Department, so I think the State Department Office of the Historian is kind of would be one potential resource, but they're very clear on their site about what they actually have available versus what's at the National Archives. So they so the National Archives is sort of the place to go for State Department research assistance. And actually the National Archives, yes, place to go for State Department research assistance. And on the National Archives website, they have guides to doing research in different parts of the collection, and they do have a fantastic guide to foreign relations research. So it's archives.gov. I think that you can get to it under the research section, but it's a lot of really in-depth information about how the State Department files there are organized, because they're sort of complicated, and there are pieces of the collection that are organized quite differently depending on the time period. And those guides, you can use them on site at the National Archives, but they're also available online. So I would probably, working with the public, I would probably say the National Archives might be the place to go for that sort of support.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for your presentation. That was fantastic. And